Thanks very much. My name is Carolyn Heinrich, and I'm the Patricia Rhodes Hart Professor of Public Policy Education Economics at Vanderbilt University. And one of the reasons I was brought to moderate this panel is in the decade after No Child Behind was passed, I studied supplemental educational services, and my co-investigator, Patricia Birch, is here with us today too. And these were, of course, you may remember, mandated under No Child Behind to provide essentially what in practice became tutoring. And tutoring delivered in many different ways by different providers. There were some really important distinctions between No Child Behind and what we're looking at today, in the sense that for the most part, providers could not be in the school district. They need to be external or private sector providers. There were some exceptions to that. And we studied the implementation and impact of supplemental educational services or tutoring, and found that, in contrast to some really wonderful things you've heard today, that many times there were limited benefits for students, and part of that was because they either weren't getting enough hours of tutoring. We talked a little bit about getting students to tutoring sessions. We're also a lot of differentiation providers, the extent to which there were actually qualified tutors, and also the alignment to school day curriculum, which is something we talked about already today too. So, each state, district, institution made a lot of different decisions, and we've learned and have talked about already today how important implementation is. And so as we think about trying to consistently achieve these high impacts of tutoring, we have to think about implementation and how we can do this well. And so this session, as Suzanne mentioned, is about reducing barriers in the market. And so we do have new opportunity today. We do have more resources to help build those capacities across districts. And but importantly, those who are in the field of doing this are going to bring really important knowledge to us about what is working and what is not. So we're going to talk now, we're going to hear 3 different perspectives on why education leaders need information on quality of tutoring and how they assess it. So first we're going to hear from Sarah Glover, who's right next to me. She's the project director for Southern Education Foundation's strategic initiative on outcomes-based contracting. She's going to tell us about her work on outcomes-based contracting and how that effort seeks to ensure good outcomes for students and alignment with the evidence-based standards without direct measures of how tutoring is being implemented. Next on our panel, we'll have Elizabeth Moore. She's the Instructional Support Director at Gwinnett County Schools. And she's going to tell us about their tutor provider selection process and how they learn about quality. So really critical things to be thinking about. And then we're also going to hear from Alex Cortez, who is a partner with Bellwether Education Partners in Strategic Advising Practice Area. He has 17 years of experience working in education social change as a consultant to school operator and philanthropist. And he will give us perspective from his philanthropy experience on how we can support tutoring providers and about the need for information in the market for us to be doing that well. So before we start the panel, I also want to note that in the past year, the National Student Support Accelerator brought together a team of educators and researchers to develop the first round of quality standards. And so at your tables, you can see there's a copy of these standards. I believe that's the case. Are they there? They're getting there? Okay, getting there. We'll be there at some point. And the reason that's important is because in addition to that, you'll see a description of the research base they draw on. We also know that the research hasn't, of course, tested all possible combinations of standards and approaches that might work or not. And so after this panel, we're going to have a few minutes at the tables to talk about those standards you see and what you think we should be testing and know more about as we move forward, trying to improve these standards and ensure that students are being delivered high-quality tutoring. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah. And you go, Sarah?
Thanks, Carolyn. Awesome to have that post-lunch slide. Yeah. Get up, stretch, whatever. probably, I don't even know how the slide thing is going to work. There is a slide for me to give you a little demo of OBC, but outcomes-based contracting. So how this discussion is about reducing barriers to the market, or another way to think about it, I think, is reducing risk for school districts to make decisions, particularly when they're looking at external providers, right? We just had this wonderful discussion about partnering with higher ed, which is an external provider, you know, maybe not for-profit, but an external provider nonetheless. And then, you know, there's many providers here, and I know lots of the districts that are here have engaged with both for-profit vendors, not-for-profit vendors, even some external government. So how is outcomes-based contracting useful in this regard, right? Why is this part of this panel? Well, what is it? Do folks know what outcomes-based contracting is? One shake, you know, yeah. What's the definition? Can you offer it up? Yeah, right? So she said, focused on the results. So that's, I mean, in a nutshell, the easiest definition is like, rather than focusing on the input, rather than focusing on, you know, the tutoring has to require this, and it looks like that, and it's delivered in this way, it's coming to an agreement on the front end of the engagement, prior to the tutoring getting started, around very specific student outcomes. And in a contracting setting, you can do that without attaching any fee to it, right? That would be wise practice in my estimation, without attaching a fee. But in outcomes-based contracting, you go one step further and actually attach a price to the outcomes that you identify. And so one of the phrases that we use a lot is, you buy the outcome, not the service. Think about buying the student outcome. How much will you pay for that versus buying the service of tutoring, right? It's just like different. So, okay, cool, so this is behind me now. I'll go to the rationale instead of OBC 101 in just a moment, but sort of on the right, you have sort of traditional, right? You pay $30 an hour for tutoring, or $1,000 kid, or whatever, and you pay that because they deliver the service. But in an outcomes-based contracting context, you would pay a base amount, right? It's not all or nothing, so it's very results-oriented, but we are not working in a system where we would imagine $0 for no outcomes. But a base pay, that's substantial, but then different payments for each outcome. And just the third column there is just to indicate that, especially maybe for the districts in the room who think their budgets are going to explode with this approach, not all students reach all of the outcomes. So the actual payout, the contract payout, right, is a function of all the outcomes that you reach. And so it's the red dotted line there shows that it's a bit above the traditional contracting amount based on this, you know, modeled scenario, but not a ton. And in fact, it's probably fair to compensate the vendors for taking on that risk. So why is outcomes-based contracting a strategy for reducing risk or reducing barriers in the market? Number one is that better vendors are more likely to show up for your bid, right? If you are paying them based on the outcomes that they're going to achieve, folks who can't get the work done are not likely to show up. So you have a self-selected group of bidders who are interested in and confident they can achieve those outcomes, which I think is actually really critically important given how crowded the space is. The second major reason is that, and I was chatting with Mary Ellen earlier today, she had better words for this than I, so I'll draft her to summarize, but it aligns the district or the buyer and the tutoring provider from the get-go on literally exactly what you want to achieve. And so there's a stronger basis for collaborative work and action and problem solving, right? Because it's not just you sit down and Brittany used the term earlier in Denver about continuous improvement. You don't sit down and execute the contract and then check back in 12 weeks or whatever. You look at it consistently along the way and look for places to adjust and improve. And you adjust and improve relative to and towards those outcomes, these very specifically defined outcomes. So those are the two kind of, brings a stronger set of vendors to the table, and then this clearly identified set of outcomes allows for the basis of like stronger or more pointed collaboration. So I'll pass it to Elizabeth, I think.
Excellent, thanks so much.
All right, my name is Elizabeth Moore. I am the Director of Instructional Support in Gwinnett County Schools. While we were in the midst of pandemic learning, concurrent learning, figuring out digital, what was the unfinished learning that has impacted us, we created, in our district, we have a process called cross-functional action teams. When we've identified a problem of practice, we bring in multiple stakeholders to look at research, and then what does research say to kind of help us drive how we're going to attack this problem of practice. And so one of our expats for student achievement said tutoring, amongst many other things that we needed to put in place as we came back to in-person learning. Tutoring was one of them, and that landed in my lap because I am MTSS and RTI and then all things supplemental programs. And so as we gathered our team together for what tutoring would look like, we immediately got in contact with the National Student Support Accelerator and really looking at how do we want to define tutoring. Because we had things called, I want to say, tutoring already in place in our district. We have a partnership with tutor.com with our public library system. We have tutor time that our high schools like to do where kids just show up and say what they want to work on and they get homework help. That's not what we were wanting to call tutoring. None of those things are what we were considering high-impact tutoring. And so we wanted a very clearly defined set of standards for what are we considering tutoring. And how can we meet the needs of our students? We're a very diverse district. I think this is slide up here. Yes. So we have 110 different languages that are spoken in our district. And so how will we meet the needs of each and every student? And how can tutoring help us with that? So we got a team together and we started looking at what are these standards for tutoring, the NSSA, the TQIS standards, and how can we revolve our bid around these standards. And so we did something a little bit different. Instead of doing like an RFI and then an RFP, we did tutoring through bid contracting services. And so we put together our bid paperwork using the TQIS standards as what we wanted them to deliver to us. So we opened the bid and different vendors could tell us how they were going to meet all of these standards. So we kind of said, here are our non-negotiables, tell us what that looks like in the bid. There was no talking to us, no trying to give, I didn't have to sit in pitch meetings and hear the sales pitches from all of the tutoring companies. It was very, here's the bid paperwork. If you have more questions, visit the NSSA website. And that was it. We had a Q&A session through our purchasing department where the different providers could get on and ask us questions. And a lot of the questions were like, well, what do you mean by data? What would you like to see in the data? And we really just said, what we want is listed in the bid paperwork. Like, we didn't answer any questions because we really wanted to see what was their best thinking behind what we were saying high impact tutoring was. And so once that bid closed, we were able to rank all of the applicants that we received based off of how they responded and what evidence they provided for each of the TQIS. And so once we were able to rank those providers, then we created one-on-one sessions with our top ranking providers to determine whether or not we would go under contract with them. And so we picked 8 initial vendors. We had, I want to say, over 40 vendors that we approved in our bid contract. I think it was about 42. So we started with 8. And then we've since then added on 3 more, because what we found is none of our schools want virtual. They all wanted in-person, and we needed more in-person providers. So we kind of added more on once we started implementation. But I think, was that everything? Yeah, I think that was about it.
Excellent, thanks so much. And I'll turn to Alice.
First, it's good to see everyone. It's still slightly disconcerting. So I was asked to talk about philanthropy, and the good news with philanthropy, it's a completely rational market. So that should be easy. But if we're trying to think about sort of creating an effective market to scale something like tutoring or other interventions, we're in a strange time because most markets are trying to create sort of a yin and yang balance between supply and demand. And most of the time pre-COVID, the logjam has been on demand. We've had supply of like fascinating innovations, but political and policy and funding barriers on the demand side have not allowed them to scale. Now we're in this odd position of like demand has now created a wave, and supply is not in a position to step up to the moment. And so I want to talk about what I think philanthropy is maybe trying to support and what this group, I think, and others like you can do. And as you know, philanthropy doesn't really play on the demand side. As John King, the former Secretary of Education, once said, like 98% of philanthropy is on supply and the best 2% on demand, and we're not seeing the equity-focused systems change we want. And I do think there's the opportunity to influence philanthropy to fund more on policy and politics and power. But I think that happens through the actions of this group, and I'll come back to that at the end. So, in terms of thinking about how to influence philanthropy, the most important thing in my mind is being very clear on the bet each of you is trying to make around tutoring. Philanthropies will have their own strategy. They will prioritize certain things over others. But if they don't understand the bet you're making, they're going to fold their cards and not support it. And so I think here are the set of things that each philanthropy needs to understand. First is, what are your values? Some people in this room are going to focus on the A+ level tutoring that goes into depth of impact. Others are going to make a design choice around something that spreads more quickly, but may not have as much per capita impact. And don't get me wrong, if there's something that can scale quickly and sustain deep impact for every student, great, let's scale it. But the reality is, in the time we're in right now, we're most likely going to make trade-offs. And everyone in this room is going to make different trade-offs in that continuum, and that's okay. But being very clear on the trade-off upfront is important. That then gets to the second piece, which is all the design choices you make as part of that bet. Your dosage, the frequency, intensity, and duration of your tutoring. If it's happening, in the school day or after school, who's providing it? How are they trained? How are they compensated? Caseload, curriculum, ratio, virtual, in-person, asynchronous, technology-enabled. It's a whole lot of really daunting design choices. And I know we all wish we could simplify it down, but the reality is, one way or the other, if you're providing tutoring, you're making decisions about each of those design choices, either deliberately or de facto. So it's better to be really clear about what those are up front. Third, of course, is measurement, and not just measurement of inputs and outputs, but outcomes, but also differentiating. Because there's nothing that sets off a philanthropic BS detector more than someone passing off outcomes as outputs. And measurements both in art and science, and people are going to measure different things, and you'll set targets yet differently. But just being very clear on what that is. I think the fourth piece is, I think philanthropy is starting to differentiate the types of bets it's trying to make. Certainly, direct service providers who are scaling tutoring are definitely going to have a lot of interest in philanthropy. Simple reality is there are a limited number of big direct providers who can scale substantially at the speed we want. So the second is more local community-based organizations. And classically, philanthropies usually put them in an awful catch-22, which is they're not able to get funding because they can't scale fast enough and have evidence. But they can't scale fast enough and have evidence because they're not getting funding. So first, I think personally, my editorial philanthropy needs to just fund those players. And we need those players to be able to step up and provide capacity. Two, one of the things I think philanthropy can also do is figure out how the larger players can transfer their knowledge to the local community-based players to support them with evidence-based work. But in doing so in a way that advances equity. Because the simple reality is that local organizations and schools are going to know the context and assets in their community much more than a well-intentioned outsider. And so I think there's an opportunity to marry the large evidence-based players building their capacity to support local players who will then innovate and customize on that evidence-based work in ways that high as well-intentioned outside we could never conceive of. And then we need a mechanism for those innovations to scale back out to the marketplace and be learned, and as a way to support those organizations getting funded. And I think part of the way that happens is organizations, some of them, pivoting from a direct impact model where you're directly serving kids to what we're calling a widespread impact model, where you build the capacity of others. And even within that, there's a complex set of design choices. And I will, with Alan and AJ's permission, say I think Saga is a really important example of this because it's growing its direct impact by directly providing tutoring in more and more districts. But it's also crucially and ambitiously growing this widespread impact by building a set of tools and supports on a breadth side where it's be able to provide the curriculum, their online platform for tutoring connection, their coaching, open education resource to anyone who wants to use it. And of course, you can measure far less impact in terms of student outcomes when you're providing something to lots of people, but it's much better reach. And they're now thinking about consulting as a way of having more of a depth impact, where it's a higher bar to participate, but they're going much deeper in their investment with the district. And eventually looking at how to then bring in districts on a multi-year cohort, which is the highest level of investment. But again, in that widespread impact model, they're not directly running the program, they're building the capacity of others, and therefore they're making trade-offs on what's non-negotiable. What is deliberately open for local places to own and customize to their needs. And then the last strategy within that is coming back to the systemic impact, which is, I think we've all learned you don't need to be interested in policy and politics for policy and politics to be interested in you. And so, as one leader once said to me, every supply side organization needs a demand side strategy. And as we sort of very quickly are going to run out the clock on all of this funding, I think the organizations who are scaling work, school districts who are scaling work, be it through the direct model or the widespread impact model, have to be unapologetic about getting involved in systems change, which means taking on shifting mindsets, to shift relationships and power, to shift policy practice and resource flows. And I think funders who start to see these different models play out and then see organizations build their skills in systemic impact, I think would be more willing to step up and fund and support. Because every philanthropy is looking for an exit strategy. The only exit strategy is changing systems.
Thank you so much, Alex. So just to recap, so Sarah talked about thinking about standards from an outcomes-based perspective, right? Thinking about performance and results. And Elizabeth talked about specific quality standards that you can build up in front in contract. And then Alex talked about the complexity of these design choices and also some of the supply and demand factors, and the fact that I think importantly, one thing we have to acknowledge is that there's measuring performance, whether it's outcomes or assessing whether those meet the standards, but it's the information we get from that process that helps us understand why did some meet the standard or not, right? Or why are we not getting enough, seeing more quality applications on this particular dimension of a quality standard. And so, one of the things that I know a lot of people in the audience can probably resonate with is, and you mentioned this too, Elizabeth, is you work with incredibly diverse contexts and students and provider markets, right? So not each setting has its own kind of variation, and which gives you either more or less range also of those design choices. So one thing to think about is, I'd like to ask each of you to talk about whether or not you think we need to think differently about what either high quality, high impact tutoring looks like in one context for one group or another. One of the things we know about standards, performance standards, is we often have adjustments for them for particular settings. And so this is something I think as we think about focusing on quality standards, outcome-based standards, different maybe combinations of those in contracts. How do we factor in these different groups and contexts, and should they look differently, or how could we design that as part of our systems to recognize those challenges? I don't know if anyone wants to go first.
So one of the things as we looked at the variety of providers that we approved was starting to look at where we would assign those providers. So although I have 11 providers, I didn't tell 130 schools you can pick from 11 providers. I specifically assigned schools a choice between 3 providers that they could choose to work with. And part of that decision-making process is I've had quite a few nonprofit organizations that were already in work in some of my clusters that wanted to grow but didn't have the funding to be able to grow, but because of the partnership, that they had with me, they were able to expand. And so we specifically aligned those providers with what partnerships they already had in place. For example, one of them is an after-school program that provides after-school care for students with tutoring, high-impact tutoring taking place during a piece of that time. But they also provide employment opportunities and other wraparound services for the families of the students that are partaking in the after-school program and the tutoring program. And so we've partnered with them to kind of build that up even more. And then we had some providers that don't provide bilingual tutors, where I've got some clusters where that's a non-negotiable. I had to have bilingual tutors in order to have effective tutoring with some of my students. And so really being very specific to what were the needs within my schools. Some of my schools, with the parameters we gave them, we really didn't intend for tutoring to be like a tier 3 intensive intervention. That's not where we were defining it. We really were wanting to not quite look at our lowest quartile performing students, but kind of in the middle there. That's where we felt like we would have the most impact. And so kind of looking at what those students are and who would be the best for that.
So I failed to mention earlier that we're working with a group of 5 districts right now, one of which is Denver, who you got to hear from earlier today. So we're live with this, right? It's not just theoretical. And so I'm drawing on some of that experience as well as some of the notion behind outcomes-based contracting. But essentially, like, we want the vendors to take on those complex design choices, right? It's like part of hiring them is hiring their expertise and hiring their agility and hiring their capacity. And to, this term might not be super well received, but sort of outsource that, right? Like put the burden on their back, right? You pay them for the outcomes and they decide and have some freedom for how to get there. Now, I think it's super compatible actually with the quality standards. And in our case of the 5 districts that we're working with, everybody had some non-negotiable, I think was the term used before. Sometimes it was around virtual or in person. Sometimes it was in school or out of school. There were a few sort of, things that each district required, but we also counseled not to get too in the weeds, right? Because what we want is, in these complex design choices and complex levels of assistance of, learning challenges to serve kids, is innovation and agility, and working on that design live. And so having the outcome clearly defined. And by the way, an outcome isn't, increased majority of students, reaching a higher proficiency level. That wouldn't be clear enough, right? It would be, at least 50% of students earn 2 additional RIT points on NWA or something like that. Like who works towards, concrete and well-defined outcomes. But to free up vendor and the district, right? This working together on it is really critical to figure out, like, this isn't working. Let's try something different. Denver had an example of attendance being super not good in high school, so they sat down and sort of redesigned with both the vendor and with some high school principals to increase that. I suppose I've already spoken to this, but just the innovation piece of it, to try to have that be part of your implementation, that you're looking for ways for continuous improvement and feeding it with, informing it with data, right? That it's not, oh, we think this might work, or those kids, but like looking, are they on track for the outcome that you've identified for those students?
Yeah, before Alex, I go to you, I just want to emphasize something you mentioned about, so one of the things we worry about with outcomes-based performance contracts, that they can be gamed or manipulated, right? So this collaboration between ensuring that there are some quality standards expectations always, and that those will be monitored so that you can't circumvent those ways of ensuring that high quality training is provided. I think it's really important just from what we know based on exact uses. So, Alex.
I think I'm going to put on my community organizer hat a little bit, which is, I think, everyone here has expertise as educators in what outcomes they want to design. But I think as we move quickly with this urgency of the moment, it's also important to not move past the communities we serve. The author Laura Esquivel once said, the person who acquires information and acquires meaning acquires power. Measurement is an act of power. It's also, quite honestly, a lot in our world an act of privilege. So I think I just name it because we are all here for the right reasons, but the communities we serve are also there for those reasons. And I think we just have to be careful as we think about measurement and the programming, engaging with them on not only what they care, but how would they measure success. And it's not that what we would measure is not what they want to measure, but we don't know if we don't ask. And if we're not careful, the communities, many of which we serve, have seen measurement so weaponized against them in the past, that if we are not explicit in asking them, what do you care about? What would you want to measure? And creating that social contract, it puts us at real risk.
So I'm really glad you said that, Alex, because it actually is a great segue into another question we wanted to discuss, and that is, what is the role for other entities, those in the community, including, for example, parents and other organizations that support the work that's done in school districts, professional organizations, the teachers and tutors may be involved in state departments of education in helping us to understand, what we should be focusing on and how these approaches we're using to get there. And then importantly, like I said, we have to have the information from our use of these standards of various types and what we're doing, all of us in the research and work to improve. We have to be able to take that information, share it out, understand it, and then disseminate more effective practices. So I want you to kind of comment on what are the roles of other organizations involved in education, the community, parents, at all different levels, for ensuring that as we begin to understand what works well, how do we really disseminate, share, and again, it may not be the same for different communities, may have different needs and different approaches to doing this.
That's a whopper one, Carolyn. I have, without, you guys think about what you're going to say. No, what it makes me think of is honestly like just the kind of the climate that we're in, the political climate that we're in, and that how some organizations can help share information and then share the information in a way that can be well received and not kind of get turned upside down or something. I'm probably speaking too elliptically, but it feels like we are working really hard in this right on like what works and how do we scale it and how do we set aside the dollars for it and everything. And meanwhile, there's some actions underway, politically motivated action underway that are doing a lot to make it really challenging to move forward. And so I'm trying to tie to your question of like, what does it mean to spread good information and what works, and how do we do that successfully in a rather charged environment?
Or even, as you were talking about, what are those, is your understanding of quality standards that really matter too? Alex, do you want to?
Well, I was going to share a thought that, as amazing it may be to the people in this room, there are probably parents in many of our communities who have no idea what tutoring is. They weren't exposed to it, they didn't live and grow up getting tutored. So if we just start talking about tutoring, they have no idea what it is we want to do with and potentially to their children. And this is, so I suppose we're a philanthropic hat, this is more my critique of philanthropy, which is philanthropy usually makes a decision, decides, and imposes an agenda on a community. And I don't think, this may sound controversial, but I actually think when you impose an agenda on someone, it's almost a form of oppression, which is not an easy thing to say as someone who's in philanthropy. So on the one end is deciding, on the other end is deferring to a community, which is actually sort of philosophical where I think we all ought to be, so that we actually earn a trusted role at a community's table and be a part of their agenda. But there is pragmatically a middle ground between decide and defer, and that's dialogue. And I find it fascinating talking to my friends in philanthropy actually about tutoring. Instead of saying we're going to do tutoring, and you do it, can you go to a community and say, hey, there's this thing called tutoring. Here's how it works. Here's how it's designed. Here's what it would mean. Here's how it's worked in other communities. Do you want? How would it need to look to be compelling and for how you want to spend the time and money of your community? And parents might say, well, okay, but actually our real concern is mental health right now and social emotional. In which case you can have that dialogue continue and say, well, actually, tutoring is very relational, to the point that AJ made earlier on the stage. And the point is, it's not that hard to take a half step back from a decision and start a dialogue, but it's just not where a lot of philanthropy starts. And I know it's for good intentions. We're in a hurry. We are worried about how much learning loss is happening. But I actually think it's what we got to do.
I would agree with what you just said, and we've started to see, as you, Sarah, you were mentioning, we're getting all these conflicting messages. What I've seen from my different clusters is the need for that, those conversations and those dialogues. So I think in particular, one of my high schools has started a thing where they have their community meetings. So it started with our credit recovery, which are our students that have failed their high school classes and they're in the process of recovering credit so that they can graduate on time. And they started community meetings in the neighborhoods where parents of a student that is getting tutoring, because we're pushing tutors into these credit recovery classes so that they can get real-time help as they're trying to get these credits back. The parents, moms mostly, are hosting meetings in their living rooms with the parents of other students that are in these credit recovery classes, and they're meeting for coffee and they're talking about the struggles that they're having, what are the needs that they have, and that's where we came to let's push more tutors and use tutors as a model for the credit recovery. So instead of it being a separate thing that we're doing, this is a need that we're recognizing we have, let's push tutors into there. And so we're starting to see through those communications, then a mom will say, oh, you're complaining or you're venting this frustration that you're seeing with your child. Well, my kid is doing this. Did you know the school even does that? And then that kind of homegrown communication of what is the need. And our need for our high school was for these kids. We said, we had so many kids take gap years in the last 2 years. With online learning, and so we've got all these kids that have all these credits that they've got to try to make up in the high school, and there's not time in a high school schedule because by taking away from something, we're taking away credits needing to be earned somewhere else, and so that was.
One thing, this forum is awesome, right? What NSSA has done to create and be like a convener of knowledge, information, all the tools on the website and stuff, which I think people are adopting, in fantastic ways, and much around the quality of tutoring and sort of how to think about, using it as intervention. In the 5 districts that I've been working with at LEC, the logistics have been such an outsized kind of thing to solve. So convening best practices around that, I was spoken to a little bit earlier today about, integrating it into the schedule, but in-person tutoring, the right person in the right place at the right time, knowing what they're supposed to do, and then they have maternity leave, and then they get sick, and then they don't show up because they get it's just the logistics are hilarious. So having, shared ideas around that, or, strategies that have worked, feels like it would save people a lot of things.
So one of the neat things we have about this forum that we're here today for is that we do have people from all different roles and different types of organizations and research practice providers.